My name is Grace Whitfield, and I still remember the exact words my father said to me the night he threw me out of the family home. You are not my daughter anymore. A failure has no place in this house. I was 26 years old. I had just walked away from a corner office at one of the biggest law firms in the city, a job my father had spent years bragging about to his friends at the country club. I had walked away from six-figure paychecks, from the corporate ladder he had built for me, rung by rung since I was a child. And I had walked away from all of it to start something of my own, a small consulting firm with nothing but a laptop, a folding table, and a stubborn belief that I could build something that was actually mine. To my father, Richard Whitfield, that wasn't ambition. That was betrayal. He stood in the doorway of our family home that night, his face red with anger, his voice shaking the walls. My mother had passed away 3 years earlier, and since then, my father had become the only judge whose opinion I still, foolishly, cared about. He built his entire identity around being a respected name in this city, the founder of Whitfield Logistics, a mid-sized shipping and freight company that had taken him 30 years to grow, and in his mind, children existed to extend that legacy, not to wander off and chase their own. You had everything, he said, a future, a name people respected, and you threw it away to play entrepreneur in some rented office with folding chairs. I tried to explain. I told him this wasn't a whim. I told him I had a plan, that I believed in it, that I needed him to trust me just this once. He didn't want to hear it. Pack your things, he said. Tonight. I remember standing in my childhood bedroom an hour later, folding clothes into a suitcase with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I remember walking past his study, where the lights were still on, where he sat behind his enormous mahogany desk, pretending to read documents, refusing to even look up as I left. I remember the sound of the front door closing behind me. Not slamming, just closing. Quiet. Final. That night, I told myself something I would repeat to myself for years afterward like a private vow. One day, he will need something only I can give him. And on that day, I will decide what kind of daughter I choose to be. I didn't know then how true those words would become. I didn't know that 7 years later, my father would be sitting across a conference table from me, not knowing who I was, needing my signature to save everything he had left in the world. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, so you understand exactly how a daughter who was called a failure became the one thing standing between her father and total collapse. Stay with me. Because what happened over those 7 years is not just my story. It's a story about patience, about quiet, invisible power, and about what happens when the people who underestimate you never bother to ask what you became after they stopped watching. The first year after I left home was the hardest of my life. I rented a small studio apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place where you could hear the machines running until midnight. I slept on a mattress on the floor for the first 4 months because I couldn't justify spending money on a bed frame when every dollar was going into my new company. I called it Ashworth Consulting. I used my mother's maiden name, not because I was hiding from my father exactly, but because I wanted this identity to be mine, untouched by the Whitfield name that had defined every part of my life until then. I specialized in something my father had always dismissed as unnecessary: logistics technology consulting. While he ran Whitfield Logistics the same way he had for 30 years, with paper manifests and outdated routing systems, I had spent my last 2 years at the law firm quietly studying the shipping and freight industry from a completely different angle. I saw an entire sector of mid-sized logistics companies bleeding money because they were using systems built in the early 2000s, refusing to modernize, refusing to adapt. I built software, simple, efficient routing systems that could cut fuel costs and delivery times for companies just like my father's. And for the first year, almost nobody wanted it. I remember cold calling company after company, sending emails that went unanswered, sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m, wondering if my father had been right about me all along. Then I got my first client, a small regional shipping company 2 states away, run by a man named Walter Osei, who had taken a chance on me simply because I was cheaper than the big consulting firms, and in his words, hungry enough to actually care. That one contract changed everything. Not because of the money, it was modest, but because it proved the model worked. Walter's delivery times improved by 18% in 3 months. He told other people in the industry. Those people called me. By the end of year 2, Ashworth Consulting had 6 employees and a small office space that no longer had folding chairs. By year 3, we had grown into something bigger than I ever expected. Not just consulting, but acquiring small, struggling logistics companies, modernizing them, and turning them profitable again. I wasn't just advising the industry anymore. I was quietly buying pieces of it. I want to be honest with you about something. During all of this, I never once reached out to my father. Not out of spite, though I understood if people assumed that. It was something else, a kind of self-protection. I knew that if I called him during those uncertain early years, one cold response from him could break the fragile confidence I was building, piece by piece, in myself. So I stayed quiet. I built in silence. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a plan was forming that I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. Whitfield Logistics, my father's company, was a mid-size regional shipping business. And mid-size regional shipping businesses, I knew from the inside now, were exactly the kind of companies that eventually needed outside investment or acquisition to survive as the industry modernized around them. I didn't go looking for my father's company. I want to be clear about that. But when my analysts flagged it during a routine review of underperforming regional shippers in year 4, I felt something settle in my chest that was equal parts sadness and inevitability. Whitfield Logistics was struggling, badly, and I was one of the few people in the country with both the capital and the industry knowledge to understand exactly why. To understand what was happening to my father's company, you need to understand my father as a businessman, not just as my father. Richard Whitfield built Whitfield Logistics from a single delivery truck in the early 90s into a respected regional carrier with a fleet of 40 trucks and 3 warehouses. He was proud, disciplined, and above all, resistant to change. He believed the systems that built his success should never need replacing. He believed modernization was a fad for companies that didn't understand real work. For 30 years, that stubbornness didn't hurt him. The industry moved slowly enough that his outdated methods still functioned. But by the time I left law behind to start my own company, the shipping and freight world was changing faster than it ever had. Automated routing, real-time tracking, data-driven fuel efficiency, competitive delivery windows that customers now expected as standard. My father refused to adapt. He told his managers that real customers don't care about apps and dashboards, they care about reliability. He wasn't entirely wrong about reliability mattering, but he was dangerously wrong about the rest. By year 4 of my company's growth, Whitfield Logistics had lost 3 of its 5 biggest contracts to competitors who could offer faster, more transparent service. Fuel costs, which could have been reduced through better routing, were eating into margins that used to be comfortable. The bank loan he had taken years earlier to expand the warehouse network was coming due, and the company's cash flow could no longer comfortably support it. I learned all of this not because I was spying on my father, but because it was public information in the world I now worked in. The kind of information investors and consultants track routinely across an entire industry. Whitfield Logistics appeared, unremarkably, on a list of regional shippers showing signs of serious financial distress. I remember sitting with that report for a long time. Part of me wanted to close the file and walk away. This was my father, the man who threw me out of the house for the crime of believing in myself. Why should I care what happened to his company? But another part of me, the part that still remembered being a little girl riding in the passenger seat of his delivery truck on Saturday mornings before everything went wrong between us, couldn't just look away either. I made a decision that year that I didn't tell anyone about, not even my closest business partners. I instructed my acquisitions team to monitor Whitfield Logistics quietly, without engaging directly, without revealing Ashworth Consulting's interest, and certainly without revealing my name. I wasn't ready to face my father yet. But I wasn't ready to let his life's work collapse into nothing either. I told myself I was simply watching, waiting to see what would happen. In truth, I think some part of me already knew where this was heading. 3 years passed like this, my company growing steadily, my father's company sliding slowly toward crisis, and me watching from a careful distance, never once making contact. Then, in the spring of what would become the most important year of my life, I got a call from a name I hadn't heard directly in 7 years. It wasn't my father calling. It was his longtime company lawyer, a man named Harold Bennett, who I remembered vaguely from childhood as a quiet, careful man who always seemed slightly afraid of my father. Harold didn't call me as Grace Whitfield. He called me as the managing director of Ashworth Consulting Group, because by that point, my company had grown large enough and quiet enough about its ownership structure that almost nobody in the industry connected Ashworth to the Whitfield name at all. "Ms. Ashworth," he said. I had legally adjusted my professional name years earlier, using my mother's name. "I understand your firm has expressed interest in regional logistics acquisitions. I represent a company that may fit your portfolio. I'd like to discuss the possibility of an emergency investment." My hands went cold on the phone. "Which company?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "Whitfield Logistics," he said. "The owner is, let's say, in a difficult position. The bank is calling in the loan in 90 days. Without new investment or a buyer, I'm afraid the company will not survive the year." I sat in silence for a moment longer than professional courtesy allowed. "Does the owner know you're calling me?" I asked. "He knows I'm reaching out to potential investors," Harold said carefully. "He does not know specific names yet. Frankly, Ms. Ashworth, he's a proud man. He still believes this is temporary. I don't think he fully understands how close we are to the edge." I remember looking out the window of my office that day, an office on the 14th floor of a building my father had once pointed at from the street and said, "That's the kind of place real companies work, not little startups." I remember the strange, quiet ache of realizing that I now worked in exactly that kind of building, and he had no idea. "Send me the financials," I told Harold. "I'll review them. No promises." That night, I didn't sleep. I read through Whitfield Logistics' financial records until 3 in the morning. The loan structure, the lost contracts, the shrinking margins, the warehouse leases my father had personally guaranteed with what remained of his own retirement savings. My father had put everything he had left into keeping this company alive. If it failed, he wouldn't just lose a business. At 61 years old, he would lose almost everything he owned. I closed my laptop that night with a decision already forming, one I would spend the next several weeks turning over in every direction, testing for weakness, before I finally allowed myself to act on it. I want to pause here and be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not do what I did next for revenge. I know how this story might sound from the outside. A daughter waits years, grows powerful, and finally gets the chance to make her father kneel. I understand why people would expect that ending. I even understand why, on my darkest nights during those early struggling years, some small, furious part of me might have wanted exactly that. But by the time Harold Bennett's call came in, I wasn't that wounded 26-year-old anymore. I had built something real. I had earned my own name in an industry my father once told me I would never understand. And somewhere in those 7 years, the anger I carried out of that house had slowly transformed into something quieter, and I think stronger, a kind of clear-eyed resolve that didn't need him to suffer in order for me to feel whole. What I wanted was simpler than revenge. I wanted the truth to matter. I wanted my father just once to understand exactly who he had dismissed and exactly what she had become without him. So I made a decision. Ashworth Consulting Group would proceed with an emergency investment offer for Whitfield Logistics, full financial rescue, restructuring, and a controlling equity stake in exchange for saving the company from collapse. But there was one condition I built into the deal from the very beginning, one that Harold Bennett didn't fully understand the weight of when I explained it to him. The final signature authorizing the investment, the signature required to formally transfer controlling interest and finalize the rescue package, would not come from any executive at Ashworth Consulting. It would come from me, personally, in person, at the final meeting. Harold assumed this was simply a formality, a founder wanting to be present for a major deal. He had no idea what that meeting was actually going to mean. Over the following weeks, my legal and financial teams built the entire acquisition structure. We restructured the failing loan. We prepared a full operational overhaul, modern routing software, updated fleet management, a realistic 5-year recovery plan. Everything my father's company needed and had refused to consider for a decade. I made sure of one more thing before the deal moved forward. I instructed my team that under no circumstances was the name Grace Whitfield or Ashworth to be connected publicly or privately to Richard Whitfield before the final meeting. My father needed to walk into that room believing he was meeting an anonymous investor who was simply saving his company. He had no idea he was about to meet his daughter. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late September in a private conference room on the 14th floor of my building, the same building he once pointed at from the street with such disdain. I remember standing in front of the mirror in my office that morning longer than I usually would. I wore a charcoal gray suit, simple and precise, nothing flashy. I wanted him to see competence, not performance. Harold Bennett arrived first with his associate, both of them nervous in the particular way people get when they're about to hand over control of something they've spent years trying to protect. My father arrived 7 minutes later. He looked older than I remembered. Not broken exactly. My father was never a man who allowed himself to look broken in public, but tired in a way that 7 years of pride and stubbornness will do to a person. His hair had more gray in it. His suit, once perfectly tailored, hung slightly loose, as if he had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. He walked into that conference room already talking, already trying to control the narrative before he even sat down. "I want to be clear," he told Harold, not yet noticing me standing near the window. "This is a temporary measure. Whitfield Logistics has survived 30 years on sound principles. This is a cash flow issue, nothing more." Then he turned, finally, to look at the investor he was about to meet. I watched the exact moment his face changed. I watched 30 years of pride collapse into confusion, and then, slower, into something that looked almost like fear. "Grace," he said. Just my name. Nothing else came out for several seconds. "Hello, Dad," I said quietly. Harold Bennett looked between the two of us, visibly realizing for the first time that he had walked his client directly into something he hadn't understood at all. My father sat down slowly, as if the strength had gone out of his legs. "You're Ashworth. Ashworth Consulting is—" He stopped, pressing his hand briefly against his forehead. "This whole time, you were the one Harold has been talking to?" "This whole time," I said, "I've been building something you told me would never work. I want you to understand, whoever is listening to this story right now, that I did not raise my voice in that room. I did not gloat. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways over 7 years, and in almost every version, some furious younger version of myself delivered a speech about everything he had said to me that night he threw me out. But sitting there, watching him, genuinely watching him, not as an enemy anymore, but as an aging man realizing his life's work now depended entirely on the daughter he once called a failure, none of that anger came out. It had simply worn away, replaced by something quieter. "The financials are all here," I said instead, sliding the folder across the table toward him. "Full restructuring plan, new routing systems, fleet modernization, a realistic 5-year path back to profitability. Whitfield Logistics survives under this plan, with your name still on the door if that matters to you. But the controlling equity, moving forward, sits with Ashworth Consulting Group." "With you," he said quietly. "With me," I confirmed. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Harold Bennett, to his credit, quietly excused himself and his associate from the room, sensing correctly that whatever needed to happen next had nothing to do with contracts. When we were alone in that conference room, My father did something I had genuinely never seen him do in my entire life. He apologized. Not a small, deflecting apology. Not the kind of, "I'm sorry you feel that way," non-apology I might have expected from him even now. He sat back in his chair, looked at the folder in front of him, and then looked directly at me. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I've had 7 years to think about that night, Grace. I told myself for a long time that I was protecting you from making a mistake. That's what I told myself. But sitting here now, looking at what you built without a single dollar of my help, I think the truth is simpler and worse than that." "What's the truth?" I asked. "I was afraid," he said. "You leaving that law firm wasn't really about you failing. It was about me realizing you didn't need the life I built for you to matter. And I couldn't stand that. So I called it failure, instead of admitting it terrified me." I sat with that for a long moment. I won't pretend it undid 7 years in an instant. It didn't. But I understood, hearing him say it, that this was the closest my father had ever come to genuine honesty with me in his entire life. "You could have called," I said quietly. "Any time in 7 years." "I know," he said. "Pride is a very expensive thing, Grace. I think I understand now exactly how expensive." I told him then what I hadn't fully admitted even to myself until that moment, that I hadn't taken over his company to prove anything to him, that the plan had started, honestly, as a business opportunity I happened to notice, and had slowly become something more complicated the closer it got, something tangled up in old wounds and old love that never fully disappeared, no matter how badly he had hurt me. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I said. "I'm doing it because despite everything, I still didn't want to watch everything you built disappear. That has to mean something." My father, a man I had never once seen cry in 26 years of my life, sat quietly in that conference room with his eyes wet, staring at the folder that represented both his company's survival and his daughter's quiet, 7-year climb to the position of deciding whether it survived at all. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we sign the agreement. And then, if you're willing, we figure out what kind of relationship we're allowed to have after everything. Not the one we had before. Something new. Something honest this time." The signature page sat between us for a long moment, before either of us reached for it. I want to describe this moment carefully, because I think it holds the entire meaning of this story. My father had once stood in a doorway and told me I had no place in his house because I chose to build something of my own instead of following the path he had already carved out for me. Now, 7 years later, his entire future depended on a single signature, his signature, authorizing his daughter's company to take control of everything he had spent 30 years building. He picked up the pen slowly. His hand, I noticed, was not entirely steady. "For what it's worth," he said, "I am proud of you. I should have said that 7 years ago instead of what I actually said." "I know," I said. "I heard you say it just now. That's what matters." He signed the page. In that single motion, Whitfield Logistics became, formally, part of Ashworth Consulting Group's portfolio, with a full modernization plan set to begin within the month. My father would remain on as a consultant and figurehead if he chose, his name still on the building, his legacy technically intact. But the decisions, moving forward, belonged to the daughter he had once disowned. I didn't feel triumphant in that moment, the way I might have imagined feeling years earlier. I felt something quieter, something closer to peace. Harold Bennett returned to finalize the paperwork. The rest of that meeting moved efficiently, professionally, the way business meetings usually do once the emotional weight of a moment has passed. But something had shifted permanently in that room, something neither of us said out loud again that day, though I think we both understood it clearly. The daughter he called a failure had quietly become the reason his life's work survived. I wish I could tell you that everything between my father and me healed instantly and completely after that meeting. Real life rarely works that cleanly, and I think it's important to be honest about that, instead of pretending otherwise. The first few months of the restructuring were tense. My father struggled, understandably, with no longer being the final decision maker in a company that carried his name. There were disagreements about modernization, about which routes to cut, about which longtime employees needed retraining versus which positions needed to be restructured entirely. Some days, old patterns crept back in, his voice sharpening, my patience thinning, both of us slipping briefly into the roles we used to play before everything changed. But something was different underneath those disagreements now. He listened, even when it visibly cost him something to do it. And I made a point, every time tension rose, of remembering the man who sat across that conference table and told me, for the first time in his life, the truth about his own fear. By the 6-month mark, Whitfield Logistics had regained one of the 3 major contracts it had lost years earlier. New routing software cut delivery times by nearly 20%. Fuel costs dropped. Employees who had watched the company struggle for years began, cautiously, to believe in its future again. My father started showing up to the office differently too, not as the owner barking orders from behind a closed door, but walking the warehouse floor, talking to drivers he had known for decades, learning, slowly and reluctantly, how to lead in a way that didn't require total control. We started having dinner together every other Sunday, something we hadn't done consistently since before my mother passed away. We didn't always talk about the company. Sometimes we didn't talk about much at all, just sat together, rebuilding something that 7 years apart had nearly let die completely. I won't pretend the wound from that night he threw me out fully closed. Some things leave a mark permanently, no matter how the story ends afterward. But I learned something important during those months that I think matters more than a clean, perfect resolution. Healing doesn't require forgetting what happened. It just requires both people choosing, again and again, to show up honestly for what comes next. I think about that night often. The night my father stood in the doorway and told me I had no place in his house because I had chosen to build something of my own. For years, I let that moment define how small I believed myself to be. I let his voice become the standard I measured my own worth against, even after I left that house, even after I started building something entirely separate from him. It took me a long time to understand something that I want to leave with you now, whoever you are, listening to this story tonight. The people who call your ambition a failure are very often not seeing you clearly at all. They are seeing their own fear reflected back at them. Fear of losing control, fear of being wrong about the path they built, fear of watching someone they love choose a different life than the one they imagined for them. I didn't build Ashworth Consulting to prove my father wrong. I built it because I believed, quietly and stubbornly, in something he couldn't see yet. And in the end, that quiet belief became the very thing that saved him. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it is this. You do not need the approval of the people who doubted you in order to become exactly who you were always capable of becoming. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply surviving, quietly, on your own terms, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. My father called me a failure the night I chose to walk away and build something of my own. 7 years later, he needed my signature just to stay standing. I signed it, not to prove a point, but because somewhere between the anger and the silence and the years of building alone, I had become exactly the kind of person who could afford to be generous, even to the man who once told me I didn't deserve a place at his table. And that, in the end, was worth more to me than any apology he ever could have given me that night at the door.